All right, so last week I made a video critiquing Dr. Mike's terrible workout technique and some of the advice that he just is so confidently incorrect about that he gives to his followers. And it got some good traction. There was some good discussion in the comments as well. So if you haven't seen it, go check that out. I covered a lot of things in that video that I'm not gonna really rehash on this. I went over his technique flaws on a couple of specific exercises, how his lifting technique affects his aesthetics in a really negative way and really limits and impairs his range of motion, and how him and Jared Feather actually don't use the same technique even though they follow the same principles. It's actually quite different, hence why Jared looks the way he does, like a bodybuilder, and Mike carries more of like a powerlifter look. So what I want to do on this is just clarify a couple topics that came up in the comments and make sure that everybody really understands exactly what I'm talking about and how there's no debate on a lot of this stuff. It's just biomechanics. It's just the way it is. So I'm not an internet guy. I don't do anything online. You know, I make money in the real world. I make a great living in-person training. I have kids, I have a family, so I'm not looking to get internet clout at all. This is just fun, and I'm looking to help some people. So a lot of people said I'm trying to do this to get a following, and I don't give a shit, okay? So one thing I did touch on in that video that I'm gonna dive into just a little bit deeper was the fact that you can't really just appeal to authority when it comes to Mike being able to give this umbrella of advice on all things fitness related, okay? He's a PhD in sports physiology, so that does not make him a biomechanics or kinesiology expert. He only had to take 2 biomechanics classes throughout his whole undergraduate to his PhD program. So it's like just a typical undergraduate for kinesiology would take a lot more than that. And it's worth noting that this is the only school in the entire country that offers this PhD, this East Tennessee State. And I mean, honestly, usually that's not a great sign. You want more of a standard, okay? And so I was curious and I wanted to look at his dissertation, okay? And I really wish I could have purchased the whole thing. I tried to buy the 153 pages of it, but I got some error message, it wouldn't let me, but I think I could have found some gold nuggets in here. But let me share with you, let me show you how Dr. Mike earned his doctor status, okay? All right, so this is his dissertation, The Interrelationships of Fitness Characteristics in Division I Athletes. Michael Israetel, fucking dirty commie. Okay, so let's see what kind of amazing novel work that Dr. Mike was working on. The purpose of this dissertation was to explore the interrelationships of several important fitness characteristics in Division I athletes. Okay, so we're going to see what makes a good athlete. All right, I guess we can make a PhD paper on that. I'm sure there's a lot that went into it. It's pretty complex. Did a lot of experiments, a lot of ingenuity. All right, so we're just gonna go ahead and go through the conclusion, okay? So, analysis revealed several important relationships. Firstly, strength is highly related to muscularity, with lean body mass as one of the most important determinants of strength. So if you're jacked, you're gonna be stronger than a skinny bitch. Okay, I think we all pretty much know that. Secondly, athletes who can produce high relative forces and powers tend to be considerably higher jumpers and much faster sprinters. All right, so if you're naturally more explosive, you're gonna run faster and jump higher. I mean, isn't that pretty established like it has been forever? Lastly, leaner athletes outperform less lean athletes in almost every metric, especially relative strength and power, vertical jumping ability, and sprinting ability. Bravo. Thank you, Dr. Mike. Thank you for this brave and groundbreaking research, letting us know that fat people can't jump high. PhD. And now you can be the fitness authority to everybody. I mean, I gotta admit, it's not a bad grift, okay? You get into the only school that offers this shitty PhD, you do a horrible dissertation that's not gonna get a lot of scrutiny because it's the only program in the country, and now you are the go-to fitness authority for all things in the whole entire industry. So congratulations, I'm not hating, it's a good grift. And I'm not gonna go into the details, but I did compare his to Joel Seaman just to get an idea of what the difference was. And you can take a quick look, feel free to check it out on your own. You can pause it if you want. Comparison of resistance training protocols and the transient effects on muscle function and performance. Already, it sounds like a way better PhD paper than Mike's. So in this, they talk about post-activation potentiation and how to activate that. So this just reads a lot more like I would think a PhD thesis would. So what I realized after I posted the video was that Dr. Mike has, you know, a lot of different types of fans. I would really say most of them kind of fall under maybe 4 types. You have the real fair weather fan who just follows him because he's such a big fitness influencer, and they see some stuff and they take what they like and leave what they don't like. And then you have like the absolute beginners, and for them, you know, your ignorance is forgiven. Okay, you don't know any better. Dr. Mike is an exercise scientist. He really talks like he knows what he's saying, but in reality, when it comes to biomechanics, he couldn't be further from the truth, and that is not his expertise at all. So I don't put that on you. I put that on him for being misleading and acting like he's some biomechanical guru, okay? So the other two groups are two groups of nerds, and I love nerds. I'm a nerd in some ways, but you have like the normal nerds, the smarter nerds who like the evidence-based approach and like that he can cite some studies, but they also see some flaws in some of his reasoning. They understand physiological reasoning more than the other group. And the other group is a different group of nerds, and they're just kind of like fucking dumb nerds. Nerds who just blindly follow him because he has a PhD and think that every single thing that you say has to have a peer-reviewed study, when in reality, it's like things get peer-reviewed study after they've already been known to be effective for a long time. And that's the problem with going too far in the evidence-based approach. So for you dumb fucking nerds, which is not a lot of you, this is a very small percentage, so I'm not talking to many of you, I'm talking to the ones that don't have any ability to deduce and reason on their own. I'm gonna give you some good studies that hopefully get my point across, okay? So my main issue with Mike's lifting technique pretty much all stem from the fact that he has no respect for the stack, or it could be called the zone of apposition, it could be called intra-abdominal pressure. It just depends on how you were taught and what system you're looking at. And that's something important to know, is that there's all these different systems that have independently come to the conclusion that we want our ribs and our pelvis to be generally stacked on top of each other to prevent injury, to minimize loss of range of motion during heavy loads, and also that this should transfer force optimally onto the muscles, less onto the joints and tendons and ligaments. I mean, so many different systems address rib flare, and you have MIS, you have DNS, you have PRI. I mean, even FRC indirectly addresses it through all the spinal segmentation they do. So it's like, if all these different systems think it's an issue and should be addressed, it probably should, because these are made up by a lot smarter people than Mike. These are made up by people who have like real PhDs, and not just like individuals, like teams of them. Some of the smartest individuals ever when it comes to biomechanics of the human body. So this is stuff that should just be known. You don't really need studies for this, but for you evidence-based nerds, I'm gonna show you guys some studies that should help you see that having a stack and not just throwing your back into extension is the way to go. So these are a couple of studies that just go into the importance of the transverse abdominals and intra-abdominal pressure to prevent and treat low back pain. So the position they recommend is that stack rib cage over your pelvis, not that arch, throw your ass back and neck back position. That's like the cue that I give the most to anybody is ribs down, because you have to respect the stack, you have to respect that intra-abdominal pressure. That is the exact opposite of what Mike does. The last thing I would ever say is
like arch your goddamn back, or arch her upper back.
Because now we're sacrificing all kinds of relative lengthening and tension on the muscle. All right, so here's a study that just is showing the effect that having a neutral pelvis can have on repositioning your limbs and giving you better ranges of motion and putting less pressure on your back. So this is called the efficacy of pelvic repositioning exercises on pain, hip, and shoulder range of motion, okay? So again, this is a peer-reviewed study. It's one of the ones that PRI cites a lot. And basically what they did is they got people who were in really bad patterns called pec patterns from PRI. Again, depending on your system, you might call it something different. It might be called a tertiary pattern, could be a state of inhalation. It could be a lot of different things. And again, just shows you all these different systems address the same issues, okay? So what it did is it took these people that had these really dumb forward pelvises, and it did some pelvic repositioning, and it increased the range of motion dramatically and improved their pain perception a lot. So it increases the range of motion almost across the board on all range of motion from the joints of the hips and shoulders. So this goes to show you the importance of trying to maintain that neutral position the best you can in order to preserve your joint integrity. So what happens is, I wish I had like a skeleton, I'll try to get one. So as your pelvis anteriorly tips and you start to dip forward, your femurs have to start to externally rotate so that femoral head can fit in that acetabulum still, because it's kind of changed position. It's tipping forward, but it's also flaring out. So now your hips and your knees and your femurs start to flare out together. Okay, and what that's gonna do, that's gonna just take away all your internal rotation. And as you can see, when Mike was doing those lunges, he didn't have internal rotation on his left side. That's why he had the foot collapsing and the knee falling in. And then similarly on the ribs, whenever you open and flare and flare and flare, it's going to excellently rotate your humerus, and you're not going to have internal or external rotation. You can see Mike has no external rotation whenever he is doing the Smith bar squat, and I guarantee if I check his internal rotation, it'll be terrible. So it's not like this is like voodoo. This is what happens to the body when you load it repeatedly, okay? Again, it's not an issue to be there and to be able to get out of it, but when you can't get out of it, and again, Mike's not gonna be able to get out of it because he's only loads his body that way. You want your body to go to there as a last resort. You wanna extend at the very end when you got nothing left to give. All right, so for your evidence-based nerds, we got one more peer-reviewed study, okay? The effects of postural and anatomical alignment on speed, power, and athletic performance in male collegiate athletes, okay? A randomized controlled trial. So again, you guys gotta love that one. Randomized control, that's right up your alley, okay? So we're just gonna go to the conclusion to save some time. Check this out if you'd like. Non-manual exercise techniques based upon the science of PRI may equalize asymmetries. Improvements in symmetry of joint motion may indicate a restoration of neutrality of the pelvis and femoral acetabular joints. Boom, first try, I didn't have to redo that. By improving anatomical alignment through establishing a neutral pelvis, athletes may demonstrate improved neuromechanical efficiency and kinesthetic control. Okay, so this starts to tie into the idea of joint centration, okay, which is a big theory of DNS, where having a neutral spine allows you to produce force optimally throughout the body in the most productive way, where you're not going to put a lot of stress on your joints and your tendons and ligaments. All right, so we'll look at that. This is a study that was funded by DNS people, I believe, so it's not peer-reviewed, I don't think, okay? So the role of intra-abdominal pressure in the unloading and stabilization of the human spine during static lifting tasks. So this study talks about the role of the diaphragm as a stabilizer for the spine as well. And one of the sentences says, the dual role of the diaphragm is essential for spinal stability and all resultant movements, especially for the complex tasks that compromise athletic performance, okay? So if your diaphragm can't function, because that's your go-to, your performance is gonna suffer. A recent study demonstrated that abnormal postural activation when isometric resistance was applied to the extremities might serve as an underlying mechanism of chronic low back pain. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why, even though you're not transferring force through your neck or whatever the fuck Mike says that I've heard repeated so many times, it's still not gonna be a good thing. You still can end up hurting yourself because you're isometrically in that crazy extended position transferring force. It also says intra-abdominal pressure regulation can be disrupted by insufficient postural function of the diaphragm, resulting in increased compressive forces on the spine due to the compensatory activity of the superficial spine extensors and abnormal position of the chest or rib cage. Hello, again, how Mike does everything. And Jared Feather and whoever else you guys talk about that follow the same principles, I've watched them work out. They're not overextended. They're in a good position. They are intuitive enough to know when they feel more tension on the muscle. All right, so this is a picture of how you should actually stabilize yourself during these heavy lifting tasks. And you can see it's a combination of your diaphragm, your obliques, your transverse abdominals, and together they create this intra-abdominal pressure that stabilizes your spine from the inside. So that's optimal. Let's compare that with what Mike looks like. All right, so on the left we have that nice stack, okay, the zone of apposition, intra-abdominal pressure, protecting our back, okay, also transferring forces better. Over here, we have that barrel chest, flared ribs, the extended spine, and the belly pooch. That is exactly what Mike presents as, okay? So I have this flip just so you can see the symmetry from the same side, okay? All right, so this just goes into everything that is needed to stabilize the spine from the inside. Talks about the pelvic floor, which Mike's is totally descended. Again, part of the reason for that belly pooch. All right, on this page, they get into the theory of joint centration, which I mentioned earlier. Joint centration occurs when joint surface congruency in muscles that support the joint are at their optimal mechanical advantage, okay? So it's saying you get that by doing that stack, by creating that intra-abdominal pressure. The centrated joint allows for optimal load transference of muscular forces across the joint and along the kinetic chain with minimal mechanical stress on the passive structures such as ligaments, capsule, cartilage, and joint surfaces. Okay, isn't that what every bodybuilder wants? More tension on the muscles, okay? More ability to go hard without damaging the structures that we don't want to get involved. And again, this isn't a peer-reviewed study, but it's a very respected theory that's been proposed by all kinds of different approaches. And again, like I said, people way smarter than Dr. Mike. And it's something you should be able to just intuitively feel. When you have a neutral spine, you feel way more on the muscle. I mean, when I was a young kid who first started working out, I struggled between should I, live like an asshole like Dr. Mike and lift more weight, Or should I make it hard I just realized if I control my ribs and kind of engage my belly, it felt heavier, but I felt more on the muscle. So that's what I did. It should be intuitive. All right, so I'm just gonna read the first sentence and the conclusion, okay? So, dynamic core stability for optimal athletic performance is not achieved purely by adequate strength of the abdominals, back extensors, or any other muscles in isolation. That's all Mike has, back extensors and rectus abs. That's not what you need to promote optimal athletic performance. That's why Mike doesn't look athletic. He looks like a gnome berserker barbarian. Dungeons and Dragons, I am a dork. Okay, and here I just have a ton of references for the zone of apposition from postural restoration. Again, that's another approach to the intra-abdominal pressure. 22 studies. I just wanted to go over this little simple graph real quick just to also illustrate what a loss of range of motion does to your strength in all ranges. So we're always weaker at the end ranges of motion, okay? So let's say we were to lose 10 degrees of range of motion. Now we're weaker here, but that overall curve, I mean, this is gonna be shitty, it's not a curve, is gonna be a lot lower because everything's closer to an end range of motion. That also gives you a lot less room for error if something goes haywire a little bit. So when we lose range of motion, we lose the ability to produce force across that whole range. So a couple topics that came up in the comments that I think I could clarify with, especially for beginners, is what exactly is an orientation strategy? What does orientation mean? So an orientation strategy is when you lose your stack and you lose relative motion and you orient a group. Usually it's pretty much always gonna be, you're gonna flare the ribs or internally rotate the ribs. You could think of arch the back, around the back, but really it's more of a rib thing. Or you're going to dump your pelvis forward and anteriorly tilt, or you're gonna tuck and round others. So those are gonna be pretty much the main types of orientations, okay? And so when we think of orientation, we need to know what relative motion is too. So relative motion is when things move like interdependently of each other. So for example, when Mike rows, I see rib flare, retraction immediately. What I don't see is shoulder extension into the retraction. So the most common orientations are something like doing a military press and I'm arching because I'm struggling at the end range. A butt wink at the bottom of squat is a common orientation. Like if I'm gonna fly and I can't hit that end range contraction, I might round to get into it. So the orientation strategies that I see Dr. Mike use the most are really excessive lumbar extension on any kind of lower body movement. And that's because he has no internal rotation, like at all. So the relative motion that should be occurring whenever you're hinging or you're starting a squat is your sacrum with your pelvis, with your innominate bones, okay? So as you initiate a squat or you're going into a hinge, your sacrum needs to tilt forward and then your innominate bones and your femurs need to internally rotate back around behind it, okay? If you can't do that, if you don't have the range of motion, you can just really arch your back and create an artificial range. And then when you get to a certain depth, you need the opposite to happen. You need that sacrum to tip back and those innominate bones to externally rotate forward around it. Okay, and if that doesn't happen, that's when you'll see the butt wing. And so that's something that Mike does on pretty much every deep squat, everything. That's why he's able to get in that in-range position that looks so good, but he's putting his back through a lot to get there. And in the process, taking it off his legs. I talked about the other orientation strategy he uses a lot is with the rib flare on the presses. And I mean, he's also not getting any relative lengthening. So that's another topic that came up. So let's talk about that in this instance real quick. So relative lengthening is getting to a stretch position under load. So when Mike says, pre-stretch your pecs, it's fucking retarded. You want to eccentrically lengthen under tension. That's gonna get you a much more meaningful contraction. So think about it, try it. Just do your presses the way Mike does with those really flared ribs and elbows out wide and very minimal protraction and just squeeze those shoulders back. And then stop, get to the bottom of it, depress your ribs and feel that increase in tension and then press from there and feel how much more eccentric load you get and how much better that actually feels, how much more tension you feel on your pecs. Again, it's just basic mechanics, guys. So another issue of the relative lengthening is the way he recommends us to really arch your back as soon as you start a hinge of any kind. And so again, you gotta think about what's happening on that. So if you start your hinge right here, okay, what am I doing, okay? Yeah, I'm stretching my hamstrings, but there's no tension. I'm just starting in a little bit more of a hip flexed position, and I've got a little extra hyperextension on my back. That hyperextension is not doing anything to stretch my hamstrings. That's the hip flexion. Okay, so there's no difference between starting like this and starting neutral and getting there. That position is the same, except now I've loaded and I got way more tension on my hamstrings, and I'm also not overextending my back. And so that's what relative lengthening is. Feel the difference. See which one feels better and what you feel more tension on. Again, it's about the degree of hip flexion, not the degree of your back arch. Again, basic anatomy, basic biomechanics, Mike. You know, and I just see such a lack of control of his ribs on everything. When he was doing the flies, his ribs went right away. Again, when Jared Feather did them, they stayed down. Every time these ribs flare, you're taking away tension from whatever you're trying to hit. And also, if your ribs are just stuck in that external rotated position, you're not gonna really be able to get any real length and tension on your lats either. It's gonna be really hard to get any lat activation at all. All right, so I hope I've kind of made it a little more clear of why it's important to have integrity in your stack, why you wanna have a little bit of intra-abdominal pressure. And again, I'm not critiquing anything else Mike talks about. I don't listen to shit that he talks about, but I mean, I know he's big on range of motion, which it's good. Use all the range of motion you can, but keep a relative range of motion. Keep it on the muscle. Okay, don't sacrifice tension just to get a bigger stretch. And I mean, we've known to stretch your muscles as you work them out forever. I mean, I've got a book from Bill Pearl from 1960 where he talks about it. And I know he talks about not going to failure. And we've always known you don't have to go to failure to get results. But I think it's important to know that his failures, which is a lot different than what like my failure, what your failure should be. So if we're starting with integrity as far as the stack goes, our failure is gonna have 1 or 2 reps looking the way Mike looks from the very beginning. And you're not gonna have a lot of injuries. You're gonna be able to recover a lot better from that. So to me, failure is hitting biomechanical failure. And I do that basically every single set. Right, so hopefully we can just be done. I can be done with Mike topics. I never wanna have to hear a video of him again. If he's not giving some shitty advice about technique, it's just some meandering flow of nothingness to get to some very basic point that could have been reached like 10 minutes earlier. So again, I don't have any hate for Dr. Mike. I just think he's really condescending, and I think, like I mentioned before, he is very confidently incorrect with a lot of the advice he gives, and he has a lot of people that don't know any better that follow him. So this is for you, and again, just take everything you hear from any of us with a grain of salt. Do your own research. So I hope you found this video informative, maybe a little bit entertaining. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down. As you can see in the last video, I really try to respond to everybody because I think there's good discussion to be had. All right, thanks.